Hi, everybody, and welcome back. This is Dr. Rewat Deonandan, Global Health Epidemiologist. In this episode, I'm going to play for you the audio of a presentation I gave recently at the Action Global Health Network Global Health Conference in Ottawa. I was the second keynote speaker at this event, and I tackled a question I've often asked myself, which is, are things getting better or are they getting worse? It depends a lot on who we listen to and on which data we examine. As we commence this presentation, the host, Sheridan, has just introduced me as Lord Deonandan because I'm technically a lord. I purchased a lordship for $50 online because that's what aristocracy is actually worth these days. So, enjoy. Or record now. I'm recording. Great. Yeah, I am a lord. I paid $50 online to be a lord. It's fantastic. And I was telling Sheridan earlier, I went to England last year as someone's date at an awards event, and this big reception happened in England. They asked me how I want to be addressed. I said, well, Lord Deonandan. So yes, I was introduced as Lord Deonandan in England. It was fantastic. Nobody questioned it. What I'm going to do today is talk about, are things getting better or worse? And the reason is, if you're like me, you're watching, this orange-haired mutant in the White House, various comings and goings in the media, and you're wondering, what is happening to the world? What's going on? We're doing so well. We thought so, and now things are falling apart. Or are they? Or if you are global health students, as you are, or practitioners, you probably expose yourself only to suffering. That's your viewpoint. You see people struggling around the world, you see disparity and hurt, and you say, why is this happening? We've done all this work, why is it not getting better? I want to suggest to you that there is a way of looking at the data that suggests, in fact, that things are getting better. Or maybe not. We'll see. I'm not sure what the narrative is going to emerge from this presentation, but I have some data we're going to look at and see if, in fact, we can come to some consensus over what it all means. I love this graphic because we do have the sense that, in fact, every generation is getting a bit more problematic. We old fogey, well, my day, we didn't have attention deficit disorders. Of course we did, right? So I want to suggest to you that things maybe are getting better, but our strange sense of nostalgia prevents us from fully appreciating the amelioration that may be taking place. But then we see stupid shit like this. Maryland rejects $11 million for Baltimore schools, but builds new jails for youth. So this is the stuff we see in the media. Is this indicative of the true trend in policymaking? I don't know, but I'll suggest to you that maybe the detection bias, this filtering process that media gives us a faulty impression of the direction that the world might be going in. We see things like this, which is not atypical, where clearly the unhealthy meal is less expensive than the healthy meal, and we wonder why there's an obesity epidemic. So we have people who aren't social or humanities or health sciences people probably don't realize that obesity is associated with poverty. They think about what they see on Sunday evening infomercials, the skinny, starving, always black children, and they associate low body weight, skinniness with poverty. So there it is, at the bottom left of that curve. Where's my mouse? Over here. No obesity due to extreme poverty. And then they see Hollywood stars on TV, and they're like ripped as well. So wealth and extreme poverty are associated with skinniness, but they don't realize, in fact, obesity is also a factor affecting the working poor. So the ways that we filter our information may be skewing how we appreciate the veracity of the world. Then you see stuff like this. Rapist husband gets 0 prison time, and then a teen faces life in prison for pop brownies. And by the way, you just look at him, you can tell he's guilty. Look at that. That's a pop brownie maker. All right. So Obama would do this thing in his public presentations, and I'm going to steal it right now. He would ask the audience, as I'm going to do right now, if you couldn't choose your gender or your race, where and when would you want to be born? Where and when would you want to be born, Miss Parker?
I would want to be born in Monaco.
Monaco. When?
I would want to have, at what year?
Sure.
1975.
Okay, 1975 in Monaco. Interesting. And well, you couldn't choose your gender. Okay, that's more or less what Obama's talking about. He's saying that really, if you can't choose who you're going to be and control for these factors outside your control, like demographic characteristics that lead you to be vulnerable to oppression, then the best place and time to be is right here, right now. And that's kind of the narrative that emerges from looking at indicators at a global level. When you dig down and achieve some level of granularity, then the story gets a little more complicated. But one could also argue that the best time to be alive was around 300 to 500 BC. Historians call that the Axis Age. That's when Pythagoras, Confucius, Lao Tzu were all alive at the same time, so the human race was possibly blossoming intellectually, who knows? Some people think that 200 AD was the happiest time in human history because that's when we have the fewest instances of really catastrophic warfare, according to some. Then again, that's biased by the kinds of data we have, which tend to be Western-centric. Who knows? But according to Obama, I think he might be onto something here, that now we have unprecedented wealth, health status, access to information, to supposedly charismatic and engaging teachers. Supposedly you have access to anything the world has to offer at the touch of a button. You can be in any corner of the world in 24 hours if you have the money to do so, and most people kind of do. Well, not most people, but a lot of people kind of do. So what's going on? Why do we have this disconnect between maybe what some of the indicators are saying about the quality of our lives and this impression that many people have that there is unparalleled suffering? Can both be true simultaneously? Possibly. I love this image here. It shows that the truth of the matter is this man is trying to kill this man, but the image that is filtered through media is that this man is trying to kill that man with his shoe knife. All right. There's something called the Flynn effect. Anyone heard of this? It's a thing in psychology that suggests that, in fact, we are all getting smarter. And this is astounding for educators to hear. All right? So, in fact, what the data suggests is that most European nations, the average IQ is increasing, except for Scandinavian countries for some reason, which are kind of stabling or diminishing. But if this is true, then the overall brain power of the human race is increasing, and our ability to solve problems should be increasing as well. If this is true, I'm not entirely sure. Then there are papers like this out of The Lancet. Global, regional, and national dailies. Everyone here knows what dailies are. Disability-adjusted life years, a measurement of bad things, a combination of mortality and disability stats. And this paper showed that worldwide, over the last 23, 25 years or so, life expectancy at birth rose just over 6 years. And one could argue this is in direct response to efforts correlated with the MDGs. We all know what the MDGs are in this room, I assume. I think the first speaker talked a bit about that as well. So this a global plan for development that we pursued over the last 25 years or so that maybe showed some fruition. Now the data from 1990 is not as good as the current data, but more or less we think this is accurate. So life expectancy has improved. Anyone know why? Where the investments were? The easiest way to improve life expectancy is to improve mortality rates in extreme youth. So infant and child mortality has been diminished substantially, and those are easy investments to make, but they were made. Right? They were made recently. They weren't made 200 years ago. They were made recently. The total dailies fell by up to 6%. Right? So people are suffering less at a global level according to this analysis. However, the dailies increased for non-communicable diseases, but decreased for nearly all other causes. This might be a situation of the epidemiological transition, which many of you may have heard of before. The epi-transition talks about how societies move from states of infectious disease and natural disasters to states of chronic and non-communicable diseases. So things like diabetes, obesity, cancers are non-communicable diseases that we think are associated with affluence. Right? So that's kind of the punchline here. So if we're entering a phase where suffering is suffering due to affluence, then maybe we can make the argument that, in fact, we are in a state of affluence globally, which runs counterintuitive to our observations, which is that people are suffering. We have refugee populations on the rise. We have incredible amounts of persecution of minorities. We have potentially world war about to start again. So things feel precipitous On the other hand, the indicators are suggesting that we're moving into a phase of affluence. Possibly. Possibly. Okay. So, this is Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is probably the most famous proponent of this argument that in fact things are improving. And again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with him, but I'm stealing some of his slides. And one of the inspirations of this talk was I saw him debate Malcolm Gladwell once on this topic. And Pinker took the position of things are improving, and Gladwell says no, things are not improving. And Gladwell's arguments were his incredible hair and his charm, and Pinker had indicators. I couldn't steal Gladwell's hair charm, but I'm stealing Pinker's slides for today. So some of his slides come from Steven Pinker. And by the way, looking at this photo, all I can see is Bilbo Baggins. Isn't that amazing? That's you'll never unsee this. Okay, this is a Pinker slide. Pinker suggests that in prehistoric times, out of every 100,000 people, 500 were killed by other human beings. Whereas for every 100,000 killed, 500 killed by other human beings. Whereas today it's down to 6 or 8. That suggests maybe as a species we're getting less violent, he would suggest. The counter-argument would be maybe we have other ways of killing each other that aren't direct violence. Maybe systemic violence is a real thing, as it is obviously. Right? So I'll try to give you the caveats for every observation made, and we'll see if some kind of, again, narrative or truth emerges from all of this. Homicide in Europe diminishing substantially. Right? So he would argue that in fact we're coming down pretty tremendously. Abolition of judicial torture. Okay, so this is saying that there have been legal policies put forward in these nations to make it illegal to torture our fellow human beings. Doesn't mean it's not being done. It just means it's now illegal. Is that progress? Sure it is. Is it effective progress? Possibly. It's unclear. We can't measure really what's being done, but we can measure totally what people say is being done. Discrimination against minorities. Well, this is an important one, especially given today's political climate coming out of the orange-haired mutant in the White House, is we think that countries with policies favoring minorities, meaning protecting minority rights, are on the increase, and countries with the number of countries discriminating against minorities is on the decrease. Will this change soon? Maybe. But again, policies are just policies. They are not necessarily actions. However, it's a start. Number of wars. All right, this is fascinating, isn't it? So we can go back further in time, and the data gets very complicated. But we have the colonial wars were prevalent at the start of the 20th century. Today we have mostly civil wars, to the extent that we have wars at all. But again, maybe we need to define wars a bit differently as well. So trade wars, Cold Wars, cyber wars. These are all hot wars involving actual measurable physical conflict. But there are different ways of expressing violence against one another that don't necessarily have to involve munitions. I don't really know how to interpret this graph. But one interpretation is that, okay, the violence, the state-like violence that still is prevalent seems to be internalized, whereas the more officious, organized, international violence of the past seems to be diminishing. This is another way of interpreting that same data, and this shows us that worldwide battle deaths have come down. And we can interpret this different ways. On the one hand, civilians aren't being slaughtered as much in times of official interstate conflict. On the other hand, again, destruction of infrastructure, destruction of economies may have downstream negative consequences that aren't measured on this graph. And the same way that the dailies transformed our ability to measure the impact of disease from, instead of just looking at mortality, we're looking at suffering as well, maybe this graph fails to consider the impact of policies that don't necessarily kill you, but leave you disabled or otherwise burdened. It's unclear. One thing that has come out of this, though, is that war now can be so, what word I'm looking for, not safe, but acceptable, that it may become more commonplace, right? Because now the United States is in a state of constant war. There's always some war happening, and the population is often unaware of it because it doesn't affect them directly. It's just soldiers going off to effect violence on other people. War deaths have come down substantially, right? Same data from before. Okay, sexual assault and violence. As an epidemiologist, my first thought looking at these data is data quality. How much of this is due to underreporting of violence, and how much is due to how we define violence, especially sexual violence. But if you take it as face value, this is, in the USA at least, sexual violence has come down to some extent. Decriminalization of homosexuality. Again, this is at a global level, looking at jurisdictions that have enabled policies that either overtly protect the rights of gay and lesbian people or have removed those policies that overtly remove the rights of those individuals. So that's a positive slope. There are other ways of measuring this. We could look at, positive depictions of gay and lesbian people in media. We can look at how commonly they're elected to office while being out, those kinds of things. But in this graph, at least, we're seeing some common trends. Do you feel a little bit inspired? A little bit positive, maybe? Kind of? Distrustworthy? No, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. Murders per 100,000 population. All right. So in the UK, the murder rate has remained fairly constant since the 60s. In the US, it's come down. And it's coming down still, despite the new prevalence of assault rifles and other kinds of issues with their strange society. And the world has also come down murder rate-wise. But again, data quality becomes an issue. Is the data of murder rate in Chad or Mali as good quality as we get from Belgium or Spain? Probably not. But this is what we have. Right? To the extent that it is reported and collected, it seems to be coming down. And Mexico, same kind. Just to show you, I'm not looking just at Europe and Asia, but Mexico as well. The homicide rate has come down dramatically in the past century. Now, all this stuff can be correlated not just with civil society and with development status, but also with government stability, because Mexico was slightly unstable in the 30s, and it's quite stable today. So there is a correlation between the extent to which there's protection for the civilians and the extent to which one expects a strong central government to provide police protection. Okay, so that's stuff over a period of centuries and many decades. More recently, we have this. So this is democratization throughout the world. If we accept that democracy is a virtue, and it's okay if you don't, there are different ways of organizing a society, but for the purposes of this argument, let's say that democracy is a virtue. It seems that globally we have more elements of democratization happening. Again, is it real? Just because people can vote, it doesn't mean the government truly is representative of the people. But this is what we have. This is another Pinker's graphs, and it shows us the incidence of genocide and mass killings. What happened here? Well, that's Rwanda. Okay, so this one is a little more unclear. Are things actually getting better just because in the last couple of years we haven't had true genocides? Well, there's not a whole lot of data to go by. So this is unclear. It also depends on how you define genocide and mass killing. Ever been to the Genocide Museum in Rwanda, anybody? Yeah, great. It's a fascinating place, right? Very touching place. One of the things I look for there is, what do they define as genocide? Right? And the display for the Armenian genocide is quite telling, because they actually explained beforehand how they struggled to whether or not to define this as genocide, given the political dynamics there. But they do define it as genocide. So the small numbers here are indicative possibly of definitional issues. Improved water source. Now we're getting into the good development stuff. People are getting improved water. What's improved water? Water doesn't come from a river or a pond. Water that comes out of a pipe. Hopefully it's been processed in some way. So more and more people are getting improved water, and we think that's going to increase substantially and plateau around 2025 at about 90% of the people with access to improved water, assuming that there is water in 2025. Right? So that's the big caveat here. So that's really that's going to be the takeaway at the end of the day, I think, for this. Is an old saying: the turkey thinks everything is fine up until Thanksgiving. Every day the turkey is getting more food. Hey, life is fantastic. No one's bugging me. I've got no predators. Some guy comes and gives me food every day, then suddenly, off comes the head. So it's entirely possible that we're leading up to Thanksgiving. Right? But we'll see. Life expectancy at birth. If you know anything about the way that life expectancy is computed, it matters when it is computed, because at times in the lifespan we have different challenges. The biggest challenge comes in extreme youth. At birth first, then up until the first year, 5 years. Make it past 5 years, you're probably pretty stable. 16, things get kind of wonky. That's when people start to drive. Life expectancy comes down again, right? But at birth, it's going up steadily. This is a total entire world, right? And And again, as I said before, due mostly to investments in extreme youth, infant mortality rates, things like that. We think it'll plateau at around 75 by 2025. Mortality rate for infants has come down dramatically. See, these two are kind of related. Because this has come down, this is going up. Fantastic. Now, that's good, but it's fairly obvious because that's the easy thing to do. Improving infant mortality rates is relatively easy at a developmental level. It just means providing hygiene, basic public health services, basic reproductive care, those kinds of things, vaccines, all of which are inexpensive, not technologically complicated, and just require a little bit of political will. So to the extent that we're doing what is easy, we're doing what is easy. That's great. That's fantastic. Someone might need help? No? School enrollment is also increasing. This is one of the MDGs. Hi. So it doesn't say anything about the kinds of school one is enrolling in, the quality of that school, whether or not people are actually learning, but it's a goal for the world. And we're seeing, yes, it is definitely increasing and expected to continue to increase well past 2025. Okay. The number of out-of-school children of primary school age. In 2000, it was 100 million. Today, we think it's down to 57 million. Fantastic. We've cut them down dramatically. Where, though, I'm not entirely sure. Southern Asia was a place with a really problematic schooling situation for young girls. But look what's happened. In 1990, the ratio of girls to boys in school was 74 to 100. Now there's no more girls than boys in school. So we've done an incredible job in Southern Asia of improving the attendance rate of young girls in school. And I say in school several times because I'm not sure what in school means. Like what kind of schools are these? Are we looking at just, basic literacy schools, fully functional, full spectrum education experiences? I'm not sure. Okay, global number of deaths of children under 5. That's come down tremendously in the last 25 years. That's good. As I mentioned earlier, it was relatively easy in the sense that we know what to do for this. It's not remaking entire economies, it's rolling out basic public health campaigns. And where has the change been most acutely felt? Sub-Saharan Africa, fantastic. Big drop in child mortality rates. Southern Asia, big drop. Lesser drop in Oceania, but also Latin America. So all the hot spots, really, we've seen the right changes occur. Fantastic. The MMR, the global maternal mortality ratio, has come down as well. So MMR is one of our best indicators for the health, not just of a population, but of a healthcare system. I would argue the MMR and infant mortality rate are the two of the best population health indicators that also express something about that nation's healthcare system. Why? Because of the innate nature of the human value system. We tend to value pregnant women and children. And if we can't fix or care for those two populations, something is profoundly broken. So the fact that we're doing something around MMRs is a good sign. Keep in mind that 99%, literally 99% of all global MMRs occur in low-income countries. So these changes are occurring in low-income countries, and I'm going to suggest to you it's occurring in one or two countries predominantly. Which one or two countries? Put that in the back of your mind. Right? Something happened in the last 25 years involving an economic miracle in a certain part of the world that's driving a lot of these data. And as I think is going to come out of this narrative, our lack of granularity, meaning our inability to distinguish between a global trend and regional trends, may be masking some suffering elsewhere. So we'll see that manifest in a second. Let's look at female empowerment. There are many ways of measuring female empowerment. No one knows how to do it well. So as a result, we've got like 20 or 30 indicators. An easy one to look at is the proportion of seats held by women in national legislatures. Okay, that's going up steadily. Other things we can look at are composite scores of education, age at marriage, degrees of freedom of divorce, fertility rates, all of which we think are related to autonomy of women. It's unclear. So validity becomes an issue when looking at these data as well. How valid are these indicators as truly expressing the thing they claim they are expressing? Unclear. But regardless, that's a good sign, right? More women are in parliament. We think it'll hit 32% or so by 2025. It should be 50, but we're here still. Okay. Where are those changes happening? Interestingly, the biggest change in terms of women's participation in government is in North Africa. 3% to 24% in 14 years. Anybody go backwards? Yeah, Oceania went backwards. Well, 4%, 3%. So it's not statistically significant of a change probably, but still disappointing. Okay, poverty. When we talk about international health and development, ultimately the easy narrative is about wealth and poverty, because development ultimately is about economic development. So if we can reduce poverty, the story goes, then that's 80% of the effort. So poverty measured in terms of the global poverty line, which is $1.25 a day, it's probably $2 a day now, but $1.25 when this is computed, has gone down from close to 40% to under 10%, we think, by 2025 globally. Fantastic. Again, I'm going to suggest to you that a granular approach may take away some of the enthusiasm here. Okay, but first, this is how it looks. So 1990, 47%, today 14%. Fantastic. Before we look at the granular level, ask ourselves, if we accept that these are positive changes, what has been driving these positive changes? Some people claim it's the demographics of the human population. So if you've read Freakonomics, which is a problematic book, some of the interesting insights that come out of it are that in the US case at least, the crime rate has come down because the population has aged. Interesting, right? Because young people commit crimes, old people don't. So you guys are breaking into my car, you and you, I'm watching you, right? So the fewer young people we have, probably the less crime we're going to have. It has nothing to do with the police state or the policies enacted maybe. Or it's something to do with, all right, neoliberalism. Pinker would probably suggest that neoliberalism saved the world. And this is a problematic statement. Is Ron Bonte here? No, is Ron here? Ron and I were talking about this earlier, that it really ignores some of the facts on the ground. So the argument would go something like this, that we've invested in the free market. We've invested in empowering nations to have more competitive trade, to have powerful exports, to have a really solid understanding of both their internal and their external economics. As a result, they're better able to invest in anti-poverty campaigns domestically. Their people have more opportunities globally, blah, blah, blah. 25 years later, everyone's fantastic, right? So the example always given is India. India was a bit of a basket case, in my opinion, in the early 90s economically. They didn't have a whole lot of foreign reserve left, perhaps enough for 2 days' worth of fuel purchases. And then as a result of some powerful neoliberal structural adjustments today, India, one could argue, is an economic regional superpower. So that's the triumph of neoliberalism in India. However, let me suggest to you that there's an easy way to reduce your poverty burden. Let the poor people die. Horrible thing to say, right? But that's kind of what neoliberalism run amok leads to. Is you want to get rid of your percentage of impoverished people, you raid the slums. Right? You want to get rid of your burden of HIV/AIDS, well, you let them die, and suddenly 5 years later, hey, some miracle, we have no HIV/AIDS in our country. So a lot of this data may be masking some underlying suffering that has retreated beyond the numbers. Perhaps into death, perhaps into the inability for us to measure it. Globalization. Is globalization a factor that perhaps has led to some of these positive outcomes? Probably. They're interrelated here, globalization and neoliberalism. So the Chinese miracle has to do with the growth of the Chinese manufacturing class, right? How are they able to do so? Because they're able to sell their products here. And we're able to have all our businesses manufacture in China. Everything in this room was built in China, probably. There's a study I've always wanted to do to look at how much the Chinese topsoil has come down in the last 30 years because of exporting all their stuff abroad. Right? Because every time you get something from China, you're also getting their water. Every product contains a little water. So you're complicit in exacerbating the Chinese water crisis. I'm off on a tangent. Or development. Is development to do or the cause of these positive changes? Yeah, maybe. maybe our investments in women's empowerment, maybe our investments in having people go to school early, maybe our investments in public health, in vaccination, in health education, in political stability, maybe all those investments have resulted in many of the changes that we've been seeing. And I'm going to touch upon this again when we talk about the demographic transition. Okay, however, he says, remember this is the poverty headcount. It's come down. Yay, politicians all around the world point to this saying, look at all the good we've done in the world. Poverty has come down dramatically since we started measuring it. Okay, now look at that. This is the granularity I'm talking about. So this again, same thing, number of people living below the global poverty line. In sub-Saharan Africa, our numbers have actually increased. In Latin America, they've stayed the same. In India, they've kind of stayed the same too. But China, they've come down dramatically. So the Chinese economic miracle is driving this averaged out sum. If you don't disentangle the data, you would get the impression that the world is wealthier. No, China is wealthier. The world maybe is a little bit wealthier, but not to the same degree as this might suggest, according to my interpretation of these data. So granularity is important, meaning we have to look at the individual geographical circumstances to get the full picture. Okay, what else might be happening here? Well, yeah, it's true that maybe much of the world is getting wealthier, but look at this. This is US data, and this is kind of indicative of most of the world. Since 1974 to today, the gap between the rich and the poor has been increasing dramatically. And what's it due to? Well, the poor have stayed poor. The rich have gotten tremendously richer. The rich are getting richer, the poor are not getting poorer or richer. As a result, on average, people appear to be looking richer, but the gap between rich and poor is increasing. More granularity. So I like to give the example of one of the places where I worked in Guyana. We saw over the course of 10 years incredible development there, from dirt roads to highways with ATM machines and public internet. It was fantastic. There's definitely development status happening. There's definite a sense of wealth in the population. However, the gap between rich and poor was so great, and the salaries had not changed, but the products, the price of the products has increased to the point where the poor were suffering more than ever. Because even though there's more stuff to buy, there are more services to be offered, they could afford them less and less. So do not be misled by the appearances of development when the people who are always suffering are now still unable to access the benefits of that development. The gap between rich and poor is important. Okay, this is the global maternal mortality ratio. I said it's come down. Fantastic. It has come down tremendously. But this is pregnancy-related mortality in the USA. It's gone up. I mentioned this constitutes less than 1% of the global burden, but again, granularity. In the developed world, it might be getting worse. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? Anyone know what the most common cause of death for pregnant women in the USA is? Sorry? Murder in general. Domestic violence and murder. So if you're a pregnant woman in Canada, actually, and USA, and you die, you probably die because somebody kills you. Who kills you? Probably your husband. Right? So if you're pregnant right now, give a sideways glance to your husband. So we have issues. Okay, what else might be not that great? This is changes in CO2 production, and I'm not sure why we have cement production, but I guess that's a bad thing. So we think this is on the increase, and that's bad. So climate change is a great confounder here. World employment seems to be going up, which is good. However, youth unemployment and youth poverty, working poverty, is problematic. So this is youth unemployment rates around the world. It's all going up. Youth unemployment is going up. Youth working poverty, though, is going down. So does that simply mean that the people who previously were the working poor are now the not working poor? I'm not so sure. These data don't tell the full story. You have to be able to disentangle the narrative from the data. Where are these unemployed youth? They're in the same places where people have always struggled. Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, a little bit in South Asia. Okay, so these are the hotspots around the world for economic crises. This is poverty rates among the working poor. So extreme working poverty, which is really the truly suffering of the world, in my opinion. Because these are the people often they are missed by development strategies. They're not the people who are going to the food banks necessarily, or who we can access on a regular basis because they're at work. They're not at the places where we're going to access their services. So they tend to be clustered again, sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Central Asia. All right. Now that I've confused you fully, let's talk about population growth. So how am I doing time-wise? 50 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay, good. So I'll make this fast then. So whenever I talk about demographics to a non-specialist audience, people always, well, the problem is population growth. Have fewer people, problem solved. It's never just have fewer kids. It's always those people need to have fewer kids. There's always a racist element in it. I'm fine. I'm having just the right amount of kids, me and my people. And those people are always brown and foreign, and usually have a certain religion. So be aware of the underlying xenophobia whenever people talk about population growth. The thing about population growth, though, is that we are subject to a thing called the demographic transition. And hopefully most of you have been exposed to this, but the theory goes that human societies go through several stages of social evolution. First, we have high birth rates and high death rates, and the population is low, they're kind of stable. Second, due to investments in public health, like vaccines and clean water, suddenly the death rate goes down because we're not dying in extreme youth, but the birth rate stays high, so the population starts to grow. And then stage 3, the birth rate starts to come down due to development interventions like women's education and things like that, urbanization. And so population growth starts to slow. By the 4th stage, people really aren't having that many kids and they're not dying, so population is stabilizing. And then stage 5, like Japan, more people are dying than they're having kids, right? So most of the Western world's in here. There is a stereotype of the developing world to still be over here, but no, the developing world, to use that outdated term, is actually over here. They're transitioning to stage 4, to the point where the total fertility rate is going down globally. People are having fewer kids, particularly in Africa and places like that. So it took wealthy nations about 100 years for fertility rates to fall from 6 babies per woman to 3. It took today's developing countries, like China and Iran, only 10 years to do the same. Why? Because development works, right? The accidental development here was intentional over here. Development works. Okay, so right now the relative growth of the world population is dropping. It took us to get from 3 to 4 billion people, 35 years, I think, from 4 to 5 billion people, 15 years, 5 to 6, 13 years, 6 to 7, 12 years. To get from 7 to 8 is going to take 11 years. For the first time, it's dropping. For the longest time, every billion took shorter time. Now it's going to take longer. So I said it all the way around. To go from one milestone to the next took less and less time. Now it's going to get longer. In other words, population is still growing, but it's growing less fast. I wrote an article about this for the Huffington Post, and I got so much hate mail. It's amazing, because I'm an apologist for the third world horde apparently knocking at our door. So, given this reality that we're observing around the world, we think that the population is going to reach 9 billion by 2050 and about 13 billion by 2100, but then plateau and come down from there. So yeah, the population growth is going to come down naturally due to development status alone. However, can we have clean water without water-related conflict, given that all these people need to have water? So right now, over 2 billion people get access to clean water just in the last 17 years. Almost 1 billion don't have access yet, and the water tables are falling. So climate is a big issue. We still think that income inequality is a huge deal, right? So the gap between rich and poor is growing. So how can we have ethical market economies to help address this? Climate change, I keep saying, right? If we stop all CO2 emissions now, we still have to deal with the results 100 years from now. And we need to increase food production. So given that we are going to increase food population size well into the end of the century, we need to have at least 70% growth in food production. That's kind of happening already. Right? Because right now we actually have enough food. Most of it is lost in transportation of all things. So there are opportunities here for efficiency measures to make food production match population demands. I'm going to, just a couple more slides, 2 more slides. This one here. So a group maintains something called the State of the Future Index, which is a combination score of economic health, population size, political stability, happiness, women's empowerment, all kinds of indicators are built in here. And they feel that the world is actually getting better from the last 20 years or so. And it's going to continue to get better, if they are correct. Or is this a case of the turkey syndrome again, where everything is great up until Thanksgiving, and maybe Thanksgiving is coming? So, are they getting better or worse? It depends. It depends on how you look at it. Are these the right indicators? Are these the things you care about? Have we considered the turkey syndrome? Have we have enough granularity and validity? I don't know, but maybe you do. I will stop there. Thank you very much.